What I wanted to talk to you about was a little bit about your autobiography and growing up, and what kind of kid were you? And then at what point did Rudolph Steiner appear in your life, and how did that occur? And was it an overnight thing, or was it a gradual transition? And finally, I think there's a tendency for some people to think that when you're converted to Steiner, you somehow mysteriously can't do anything else. And I wanted you to address that, as far as traditions and religion, philosophy, and all that kind of thing. But tell me a little bit about the launch pad. Where were you born, and where did you come from, and all that
Well,
stuff?
first off, let me say that that was a really good question because where most people are coming from in relation to uh, belief systems, so to speak, that
Yeah.
they mistakenly consider that this is like some kind of new religious cult or something, which is absolutely the opposite of that. It's a means to be able to investigate and to have sufficient concepts to be able to dig deeper into things and include time in your evaluation, which most worldviews, they have no view of time. They really just don't even consider that there's anything different about today than ancient Egypt and the Middle Kingdom. They think that's just a bunch of people down there that they just didn't know what we know. And we must have forgotten what they knew.
Pretty
Anyway,
much, that's the modern view. Yeah.
yeah. So, well, for myself, my life's been a series of unusual occurrences, shall we say, that intersperse throughout my biography. Because as a child, I would see like different elemental beings and things like that, and night spirits, and not the mistaken folded sweater in the closet type, but the actual beings kind of parading around on the curtain rod and things of that nature. So that
So you had direct experiences that
yeah, I
were
had
of a
direct
mystical nature.
experience. Yeah, that left a big question in my mind, or many questions, and I found out early on that I was best keeping that to myself rather than talk to people about it because apparently from the few attempts I had made, I was essentially alone in that regard in my early childhood, as far as I could tell. If anybody else was having similar experiences, well, they weren't telling me about it.
Where were you?
Well, in my room, uh, going to bed,
Was
or
this in Detroit or in another state,
well,
or?
this was when I was in Detroit, and then in when we moved out to the suburbs where I grew up, you know.
Mhm.
And but it goes back kind of earlier because a story I like to tell. 'Cause first of all, it's funny, and second of all, it's like really uh, one of my earliest memories. And my mother used to tell this story, and she would get quite a chuckle out of it because we lived near the Detroit City Airport. And there you could look out my bedroom window and see the water tower over at the airport and all that. And this room that I was in, I was just an infant in a crib. And my mother would be in there. It was the spare bedroom, and she had an ironing board, and she was repotting a plant. And she looked out the window, and it was a sunny day. It was like in the spring. And there was a UFO, one of the classic silver dish types, over the airport, just like sitting there in the air, maybe 100
Mhm.
feet above the ground. And she looked at it and she just kind of was looking at it, and the window was open. It was a beautiful day. And this like bolt of energy, like lightning, came in the room and knocked the potted plant off of the ironing board.
Wow.
Of course, very startled by that. And she said, I laughed. And so
pretty pretty
whatever that means,
spectacular stuff.
I've never I've never been able to get any additional information about that, and whether I'm a visitor from somewhere else or that's just a friend of mine checking in, or but so
Yeah.
I tend to have a rather lighthearted view pertaining to all things spiritual, and I think that that's important. Uh, I, as Douglas Gabriel, my best buddy, and my old friend David Spangler both told me separately that the thing that people that they had met you, Rudolph Steiner, they had one thing in common. They all said that he was always telling jokes. And so I like that. I think that that's a good way to look at the world.
Yeah.
But, and then as I got older, I would have like experiences of seeing, things fluttering around plants and like that. It actually developed further because by the time I was in my 20s, I had this like house brownie, if you know what that is.
Yeah.
Kind of a puppet looking little guy, and I would see him, and I had two cats, and one cat would just, the Siamese would just kind of look at it like he didn't care. But the other cat was just a regular house cat, would chase it, and it would turn into a globe of light and fly off. And sometimes she'd catch it with her paws, and then she'd look at her. You could see her startled because she'd look where she had caught it and there was nothing there. And she's like, where is it? Where'd it go? But one time I was getting ready to go somewhere, and I was at my desk and I was getting everything. I was running a little late for some meeting of something. And so I spun around to go to the door, and I noticed that the brownie was like right in front of me, down, almost up to my knees. And I stopped, and I went kind of like this, and I look at the brownie. He did the same thing. He mimicked me, like whoa. And then he flew off, and curvilinear path, and the cat runs chasing after him off into the kitchen, and so things like that, And one time that when I was talking to David Spangler from Pindorn, I noticed that the little fellow was standing right in front of me like this, and David looked down and he kind of batted him away, and he flew off, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and we nodded, yeah, I see it too.
Okay. It's nice to get confirmation.
So yeah, these things are not hallucinations. You have to make a distinction between hallucination and beings that actually have a separate existence, although it's not physical as we know it, and it's not usual by any means, because that's something that's more prominent, we know from Rudolph Steiner, back in the past of mankind. And in fact, he does specifically talk about, like in the ancient world, that they could contact the planetary intelligences through their rites. He said, but that subsided as the clairvoyance diminished as we moved into the period of the incarnation of Christ, the mystery of Golgotha and all of that, and into the intellectual soul period of 2,160 years, that clairvoyance subsided, especially amongst the educated classes, because there was like a shift of modality for one's consciousness. But he says the alchemists maintained that capacity, but only within the realm of elemental beings, which is a very interesting thing, and that they would receive their knowledge, they could receive knowledge from that kingdom. And then he makes reference to the individuals that were mining engineers. They had experience with mines, and that would include Novalis and Goethe and Manuel Swedenborg, and there's something there to the realm of metals and alchemy and the whole Rosicrucian stream. And so that's always played a prominent part in my investigations.
Did you enjoy school growing up as a kid?
Well, it was a mixed experience, because some teachers are good at it and some of them aren't. And you go through different phases in your life. I really took up my own education to a large extent because I had 4 older brothers, and one of my older brothers was really into hot rods, and motorcycles and all that. And he would get all these magazines, and I would read them. And so when I got to kindergarten, the other kids were like reading Fun with Dick and Jane, and they had these cloth books, and they'd have there's a zipper, and you could tie a shoelace.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
and I already knew how the principles behind tuning an intake manifold, okay, on a engine, a car engine, right, and the back pressure of tailpipes. I was off into all this engineering stuff.
Well, John, would you say that you were mechanically inclined?
Oh, absolutely. I tested really high, and my father, he had this Apex special machinery, and they made assembly line equipment for mostly Ford, but the big 3. And they'd make these machines, there'd be a machine that would be longer than a swimming pool, and you'd put a block of metal in there, and it'd go through all these different processes, and by the end it would come out as a bell housing for a transmission with all the holes drilled in it and everything like that. So they were pioneers in CAD/CAM, which is computer assisted design and computer assisted machinery. Yeah. But I didn't want to go that route just because I tested high on it. I went for a walk with my dad one time. I was in the 2nd grade, before we moved from Detroit, and we went for a walk, and I'm pointing at all the cars and saying, given the model and the year, and he's like, "Whoa, where did you learn all that?" I said, "Well, I read Mike's car magazines."
Yeah.
And so, I had an appreciation of all that, but he would take me around to factories of his friends to see things. I went to this one place where, those rolls of steel you see on a truck. Well, they have this gigantic machine that rolls this huge sheet. Again, it's as big as a swimming pool. And then this blade comes down and goes chunk and cuts off a strip. And then they take that strip and they roll it up. And that's what you see in those trucks. It's
right.
I mean, this place was just massive, so I was exposed to all this stuff. But I don't know, it was kind of too oily and messy and noisy. And, I was gravitating more towards music.
At what age?
Oh, well, see, I had 4 older brothers, so I'd want to watch, some kid show, and they'd want to put on American Bandstand, so I acquiesced. And I saw Bill Haley and the Comets first time they appeared on there, so I saw the whole history of rock and roll and the change in consciousness that happened as a result of that. I mean, it really was a shift.
Huge. I often wonder if the dropping of the atomic bomb wasn't part of that wave.
Well, I think it is. because it's like history has like steps. It'll go along with a certain modality, and all of a sudden there'll be a critical event, and then a change happens. And really, the dynamic that was happening at that time was television.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you had just thousands upon thousands upon thousands of kids all watching, Soupy Sales or some of these clown shows, and cartoons, and doing simultaneous events. And I think there's something about the simultaneous events. We know from spiritual science, Rudolph Steiner says that when you have a thought, that there's a being behind that thought. And if you have more than one person that's thinking that thought, that they are all in communion with this particular being. And so what you have there is this kind of Ahrimanic intelligence approaching the kingdom of childhood, essentially, is what it is.
We'll explain, in case we have audience coming in from the periphery, explain what you mean by the Ahrimanic.
Well, one of the most fundamental aspects of Rudolph Steiner's spiritual science is to be able to determine the nature of the beings that are supersensible, as they're described, meaning that you can't see them with your physical senses. And there's two fundamental classes of beings that we are positioned between. There's the Luciferic, and then there's the Satanic or Ahrimanic. Now, most people conflate those two, and they think that, it's just talking about just a different name of the same being. And Rudolph Steiner said, no, it's not at all. That the Luciferic spirits, it's complicated, because when you look at beings, it's just like looking at people. You get all different kinds of people. It's like when in looking at an order of beings, you also have to keep in mind, it's like going to New York City and you walk down the street and there's people from all over the place, and they're all into all manner of different things. They're not just all the same regimented.
Exactly.
So that's the way one has to look at it. And a good book to start on understanding some of that is East in the Light of the West. That's one of the early collections of Rudolph Steiner's, where he addresses the complexity of the Luciferic challenge and bringing in the idea of that Ahrimanic. The Ahrimanic is the materialism. That's the thing that's attempting to drive us into AI and subnature and all of this, of which I was talking about with the television.
Also, John,
projection.
Define subnature.
Subnature is a term overall that refers to the classes of elemental beings that are involved in technology and electronics and magnetism, which is more prominent in North America. Rudolph Steiner says that we have primarily north-south mountain ranges, which enhances the magnetic field. We do have, through Missouri and Arkansas, we have the Appalachian range that goes east to west. But if you go into Asia and most of the mountain ranges that are in Asia and in the other continents, they're running east to west, and so they have a different flavor, so to speak, as far as the terrestrial effects. But the Luciferic spirits, on the other hand, you could characterize it, say the Luciferic spirits are just telling, this is just all illusion. Come with me off into the some non-physical realm just to take off. And then with the Ahrimanic, they say, that's just all hallucinations. That's nothing real. The only thing real is this material realm of measure, number, and weight. And so you have, Rudolph Steiner characterizes how our consciousness is something that takes place in between the conflict of these two different types of beings, and that point of balance is called really your Christ nature. That it's not I but Christ and me that's referred to by St. Paul, of which we only partly participate at this stage of our being. So
Right.
we
Right.
think all this is going on and that we don't realize that it's all supported through the efforts of countless numbers of supersensible beings. And that's probably the primary distinction between
What
us and you and regular natural science.
yeah, what was your teenage period like? Once you entered past puberty and you were a teenager, did you rebel? Did you hit the road? Did you join the circus? What happened?
Well, it's kind of like joining the circus. I mean, I played in a rock and roll band, and starting from what they now call middle school or junior high.
Yeah.
It was like summer after the seventh grade. And so there was all of that. And, with the Beatles coming in and just the massive simultaneous media.
Also, were you a good student at the time?
I was good at things that interested me. Again, I was I'm an autodidact more than anything else. I've self-taught myself. I would read things that interest me. They didn't have to really prod me into getting into reading. I early on figured out it was something that I greatly enjoyed, and I had a great many questions. And
Right.
so it was just an unending quest, which led to, so many different avenues. I mean, I ran the largest esoteric bookstore in the world for many years. And
At what
rare
age
book
did you
specialist.
take that on?
Well, let's see. That would have been it was in the for the late 70s into the early 80s.
So you were in your 20s?
Yeah, because it would have been let's say 1977, and I was
Yeah.
born in 51. So
Okay. All right. So was that your first job?
oh no, my first job was well, actually, this is funny. The first money earning I did was when my brother, he went into junior high. I was still in grade school, and I was drawing these pictures of the Big Daddy Roth cartoons,
Oh, yeah.
a rat driving a hot rod or what have you. And so he came up with we came up with this bright idea. We'd take our white T-shirts, and I would draw one of those images on the T-shirt, and he'd take it to school and sell it. And so that business went great until we ran out of T-shirts, and my mom said, "Where'd all your T-shirts go?" So that was really my first money earning endeavor. But no, then I washed dishes at Marygrove College and a girls' school and the cafeteria. That's when I found out how much women love dessert. I get these trays back with 5 desserts on them. And that was all very interesting. I again getting into playing rock and roll and being exposed to all of that, and which presented me ultimately, when I went into the music business, and my partner Bobby Hankins and I started a record label for Virgin London.
What year would that have been, John?
That would have been in the 90s.
Okay, right.
And we had our act that was on the label, and because of the nature of the act, it was a blues rock type thing, R&B, blues, fantastic guitar player. And they said, we're going to start a label. And so I was responsible for most of the roster of the label, but we had a publishing company, and we did recording projects. We used to work on projects with Roy Sakala, who was the owner of Record Plant Studios, record plants in New York and San Francisco and LA. But by that time, he had transferred over the other studios, and he was just running the one in New York, which, geez, probably half of the memorable albums were recorded at the record plant. I mean, Roy was one of the last people to see John Lennon alive. In fact, he had this little 2-track with a tune on it that John had given him. And he said,
Right.
don't let Yoko have this. He wanted Julian to have it.
Right. Okay.
That was
Interesting.
beautiful tune. It was kind of like that Walking on Thin Ice he did with Yoko, except this was him. This wasn't a Yoko tune.
Right. I get that.
Incredible recording. So, a lot of that stuff, but I don't think that we're going in that direction today. Or if you want, we can, but
well, music,
I have lots of stories that
I'm always amazed by people I meet in different fields who have a strong musical background, because it seems like a sort of universal language.
Well, Rudolph Steiner talks about the Northern Mysteries that were founded by Scythianos, about whom we've discussed before. And he says that the Northern Mysteries were transmitted largely through music. And he said what that did was that developed a capacity within the Northern European folk soul for being able to relate to things through that type of a modality, and that what that did was that cultivated what would later come to be the highly developed music of Northern Europe, Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, all of that.
Right.
And that this Richard Wagner, I mean, you just go on and on. I mean, orchestral music,
Mm-hmm.
and also mathematics. And there's a great many high-level mathematicians from that part of the world.
Yeah, I get that.
So I found that too. That musicians were often more adaptable to understanding things esoteric.
Yeah, I guess that would be the power of improv too.
Yeah, the theater too.
Yeah. Did you have any experience in theater?
Well, it's funny because I was around a lot of theater people throughout my life. As far as me and acting, I played a lead in a play in junior high, ninth grade, something like that. But no, I ended up. One of my best friends was a black belt in karate and black belt in Aikido, Cal, and he was in living theater in Europe with Julian Beck, and they were in Fellini movies and all of that. Okay. So I had exposure through him, and the lead singer in my band back when I was in high school. As we came out of high school, just got into that time span was in the Hair cast, and the Detroit cast of Hair was famous for the musicality of its cast. Right. And I had a lot of friends in that, like Sean Murphy, who's sung with Eric Clapton and sang lead for Little Feat. She has her own band now. She was singing backup for Bob Seger. Meatloaf, he was a real character.
Yeah,
I got some good.
So it sounds like you had a kind of an accompaniment growing up. At first, it was fairly oriented around tech, and then your accompaniment was musical and involved in the arts.
Yes.
And was that constant as you entered the management of the bookshop?
Well, around that time, we did some kind of vanity projects, from the start, recording things, and
Yeah.
it brought me into a different circle of people playing, like with Daryl Dipka, who was the co-producer with Chet Atkins and
Right.
keyboard player with him. Right, he was a very close friend, and we would work on projects with Robert from the store and bring in other people, people that have played with like Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels. I had a lot of association with people around Mitch Ryder and Bob Seger, and like going way back.
But all this time, you're basically managing a highly esoteric bookshop with all sorts of variegated content.
Yeah, the Mayflower. See, we used to be in Ferndale on Woodward, which is like a main street that goes right down all the way downtown to the Renaissance Center. But this is in Ferndale, and we got visited one time by Donald Weiser from Weiser's in New York, which is like,
Yeah. Yeah, he's a big name.
Very famous. And he and his wife came to visit us, and he said, you guys are the biggest in the world. I know that because they tell me I am, and you have twice what I have. And then we moved the bookstore and doubled the size from there when we moved it to Berkeley. And so, I got exposed to authors from all the various disciplines in the history of ideas and esotericism, Kabbalah, yoga, all the different metaphysical, philosophical schools, and
who did you find yourself impressed by anybody in particular? Did anyone leave a marked impression on you?
Oh yeah, I was very fortunate in that regard, and I always gravitated toward the elders, So I was fortunate in that I had these. As I was at the bookstore, I had these like mentor relationships, but they always treated me like a peer. But I had this mentor relationship with these people from these different esoteric streams, and so I was able to develop quite an intimate relationship with these people, and kind of an insider understanding of what their views on all of the esoteric was. And so it's interesting because I just found Rudolph Steiner was really the one. I think that he's the challenge of our times, is coming to terms with him, just as in the Middle Ages, the challenge of that time was Thomas Aquinas, and back in the Greek period, Aristotle, that there are certain impulses that come into the world, and they basically lay the template for the developments within the realm of thinking for their time. And that's Rudolph Steiner, as far as I'm concerned. But it's the most difficult study I know of.
Well, did you meet any living teachers during your time at the bookshop that really impressed you, or gave you certain impressions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I again, because of who we were, and a great many authors would come through, they'd be doing book tours or lectures related to their books, and there would be all these gurus and different types of spiritual leader. I could tell you, well, one of the most impressive, I mentioned them already, was David Spangler. And the other people that we would bring in. We put on a weekend seminar here. We brought in Peter Caddy, who's one of the founders, and we brought in Dorothy McLean, who was.
So those are all the main voices of Finhorn.
Yes, and Malenko and Kathy Matanovic, the New Troubadours. And David Spangler was one of the original New Troubadours, but they were a singing group, and we bring them in quite frequently, and have bring them to the natural food restaurant and have them give a performance, and so it was just really a lot of wonderful people, but there were individuals just floating around, like my friend Maruga, as the name he was given by Muktananda, right? But he's a very accomplished in Eastern approach of yoga and all of that, but also he's a Orthodox priest. Now he's since become an Orthodox, but he's he's a percussionist. He played with Santana. He played with Weather Report. He's played with the Grateful Dead. I mean, he's played with all manner of groups. A wonderful soul. But he was very, you wouldn't know it because he's kind of like myself, a bit of eccentric, shall we say, you know. But when he would come to the store, I can remember times when I'd look over at the door because I could hear people approaching, and I'd look and I'd see the purple shimmerings of his aura before he came through the door, right? And
Wow.
he'd come in and and then he'd give me a sign, and he'd take a piece of paper, write down, and tell me which meditation he was doing, you know, that, and so he wasn't talking. Uh, you know, he's a very disciplined guy. He first encountered the Yogi Satchidananda at Woodstock and became one of his first pupils here in the United States, you know, and
Right.
was good friends with Ted Lucas. He went and studied with Ravi Shankar in India
Yeah.
before the Beatles ever even heard of them, you know. And so it all overlaps because you have, again, that artistic and the artists and painters. I have friends that are painters and people that are creative, people that create.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Ultimately, that's what we're talking about. But what
yeah,
fascinates me is you seem to have managed uh, by design or by karma to have basically had a sort of nest of creativity around you as you pass through life. And that seemed to have been consistent in the bookshop, particularly. You seem to have been in a sort of nexus.
yeah. I think that that's very much the case, and in fact, I think that in within those realms, that Detroit was one of the hotspots, so to speak, in the world because I remember talking with my friend James Stewart. You know, by the way, the founder of the Rudolph Steiner Archive, he is
Yeah.
located in Michigan also. And
Yeah.
I told him that I was told by Michael Dobson, who used to run Anthroposophic Press, that we sold more Steiner books than anybody in North America. And James
Hmm.
laughs and he says, "You sold more Steiner books than anybody in the world."
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of surprising. You know, we were just
Hmm.
doing our thing. We were doing, you know, we'd have our study group. In fact, our mutual friend Brian Lynch was a part of that circle. The Waldorf
Yes.
Institute for Teacher Training was here, which is
Yeah.
how I met Douglas Gabriel and how I met Brian Lynch and numerous other people and leaders within the movement of Rudolf Steiner's. And year after year, they would have foundation course classes, and I would take and retake and you know, I've taken night courses on knowledge of higher worlds, theosophy, and Christianity is mystical fact, and occult science and outline, you know, philosophy of freedom. All the
Right.
basic books, year after year,
Yeah.
just do it over and over again, you know, and at just the good fortune of that. And now the North American headquarters for the society is in Ann Arbor. And I think that,
What
you know, in retrospect, that we had something to do with that because there was more demand for what the society had to offer in this area because of the book. We had a sister bookstore in Ann Arbor too. It was run by
when did you
Michael
first hear
Perry.
about Rudolf Steiner?
Uh, that's a kind of a funny story. I went in junior high, and it was what, the eighth grade, and you'd line up in gym class alphabetically, and the guy standing next to me, uh, he was like, I was to find out later, he was like the grandson of the Polish ambassador. But we're standing in line in gym class, and he turns to me and he says, "Have you ever heard of Rudolf Steiner?" And I hadn't, but it's like it rang a bell in my heart.
Yeah.
He also asked me about Ouspensky, you know, who
As
did the
well.
Fourth Way, you know, Gurdjieff and
Yes.
all that.
Yeah.
And I found that interesting, but Rudolf Steiner was really the one. And over time, gradually, because coming from that early period, you know, you just couldn't go to just an ordinary bookstore and find Rudolf Steiner's works there. You
right,
had to seek them out, or and that's what it became. And starting early on, you get that. I still have the case, but I loaned out the book, so I no longer have. But they used to have this box set that had his outline of occult science, knowledge of higher world, theosophy, and philosophy of freedom, all in one
right,
little box set, right?
right.
And
What did
so,
now when you heard of Steiner, then was there something familiar when he asked you that question? Did you feel like there was a bell ringing, or did you just think, "Oh, maybe I'll look into that"? What was the
no,
effect?
it was the it was more profound than just, oh, I'll look into that. It wasn't like a curiosity, it was a resonance.
Yeah.
It's like you meet certain people and you could say they resonate with you or they don't. It's
Yes.
kind of
Exactly.
it has to do with really that's a process of inspiration. It happens within the realm of inspiration because you have uh, seeing and then feeling and willing. So
Right.
thinking, feeling, and will, and there's a certain resonance that is there with certain things, and people, whether or not they realize it, they do that all the time. And they make
Sure.
decisions. Somebody will ask you what you think about something, and they'll lay out their plan to you, but it's ultimately through your feelings that you make the final decision.
Very
In
true.
most cases, right? And so it's very mysterious, but yet very significant. And really, in Rudolph Steiner's work, the first thing is to really get people to try and grasp what a human being is, because it's hard to accomplish something if you don't even know what you're trying to do. It's like with that Alice in Wonderland experience, where she walks up to the was that the Cheshire Cat. She says, "Oh, where do I go?" And he says, "Well, where do you want to get to?" She says, well, I don't really know. He says, "Well, then it doesn't really matter, does it?"
Well, here in Cheshire, I'm in Cheshire, where the Cheshire Cat's from, and there's actually a church not far from where I'm staying at the moment that has a stained glass window dedicated to Lewis Carroll. So it's the atmosphere is certainly here. Did you manage to find teachers who had been with Steiner personally and had a firsthand experience?
Uh, some, I'm not unlike Douglas. He was like a pilgrim. I mean, he would just he'd find out about something. He'd go there. He'd get his
Yeah.
rucksack and he went around the hostels and seeking out people that had known Rudolf Steiner, and he ended up meeting a great many of them. For me,
Okay.
to a large extent, it was because the Waldorf Institute of Teacher Training was founded here by Werner Glass,
Yes.
my mentor, and Douglas was his protege. And
Okay.
he came to Detroit, excuse me,
Yeah.
from the Waldorf School in Hollywood, California. He was a
Okay.
mentor for a lot of people. A lot of people encountered Rudolph Steiner's work through acting because of Michael Chekhov.
That opens up a whole other portal.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And
Michael
so,
Chekhov was that the brother of the playwright?
no, it's a nephew.
The
He's a
nephew. Okay.
nephew of Anton Chekhov, the famous
Yeah. And
playwright.
he did teach in Hollywood, didn't he?
Well, he first came here. It's an interesting story, and then again, it involves even more associations. Because
Yeah.
uh, Michael Chekhov was a student of Stanislavski, and Stanislavski is very famous for developing method acting. And
Right.
Stanislavski once said about Michael Chekhov, "He's my most gifted student."
Oh,
And
interesting.
so, but Michael Chekhov ended up uh, coming to experience Rudolf Steiner and the work he was doing because Marie uh, von Sievers, who married Rudolph Steiner and became Marie Steiner's von Sievers, she came out of the acting milieu with the Stanislavski and that whole theater impulse that was so strong in Russia.
Okay, that explains that. All right, that's a very interesting set of connections.
Yeah, that's very, and when you look into it, and she was the one who introduced Rudolph Steiner to Edouard Charest. Okay,
Who was my first introduction to Steiner.
yeah. And
Yeah,
Edward Charest, who wrote The Great Initiates and From Sphinx to Christ and all these.
fantastic stuff.
Yeah, it's and he was such a good writer too. I mean, the clarity of his thought was very impressive. And Rudolf Steiner gave that early Paris lecture cycle on behalf of his relationship with Edouard Charest.
Right.
And it's what was it called? Esoteric Christianity was it used to be published by St. George Press, and this one of those kind of the cheesy plastic cover on it.
Oh yeah.
It was really kind of a arts and craftsy, the early publishing of a lot of Steiner's material here in the States.
Hey John, swing back to Chekhov in Hollywood. Was he in Hollywood teaching?
He first came in. In fact, I used to do a podcast with Leo Zagami. Leo Zagami's from Italy. He came here.
Yeah, I know about Leo. He's a sort of Vatican guy,
Yeah,
expert.
he's an expert on the Vaticans and on Masonic lodges and all. He used to be the Grand Master of the Freemasonic Lodge of Monaco, right?
Yeah,
And
okay.
he was also a P2 lodge, the infamous
Interesting.
P2 lodge, and
Well
Illuminati.
entrenched.
Yeah, a lot of Illuminati style things. But his father was a protege of Meyer, who was a protege of Carl Jung, and
Yes.
his grandmother, or that was his. I don't know. I can't, it's hard to keep it all straight. But his grandmother and her husband. The grandmother was like a cousin to the Queen Mom, something like that. In England,
Right. Okay.
UK. But she was very eccentric and wrote a book about her kind of misadventures as a liberated woman. But it was the two of them that brought Michael Chekhov to America. The first place that he arrived in was in Connecticut.
Okay.
And that was the first Michael Chekhov school. But in fact, I just did a podcast only yesterday with my buddy Joe Visconti, and he's the president of the American Shakespeare Society, and he's
I know the name. Yeah.
So all these things, everything seems to connect together.
Truly.
You meet somebody, and then you go and you realize that they're just a couple steps away from you as far as associations. So it's all very interesting. It's like we're flying in formation or something like that.
Yeah, without knowing some of the time. So Chekhov came in through Connecticut and then headed to Hollywood.
Yeah, he was very much. If you go to his website now, you'll see that there's different Michael Chekhov method schools, and he wrote numerous books, and people that were studying him, there's a great many of them that studied him, and he would present them with the work of Rudolph Steiner, but he didn't hard press it, and he created his own language system for acting. And so some people were working with methods that were developed out of the work of Rudolph Steiner, and they really didn't know that. You know what I mean?
I do. I do. And I was thinking particularly of Yul Brynner.
Well, no, but Yul Brynner was very, very much aware of Rudolph Steiner, as was like Marilyn Monroe and Jack Palance. But then there's a lot of other people that studied the Chekhov method. And, like Clint Eastwood, for example. He's one. You just run down, you can go on Wikipedia and look up Michael Chekhov, and you can see the luminary cast of characters that have studied under him directly or in one of his groups that he founded. And so
Right.
it's interesting because it's the challenge that was observed in the method acting is that when people take these traumatic experiences and relive them, that it tends to like weigh on you psychologically. And when these people get to be around 40, they can sometimes start to come uh, perhaps unattached, or they just kind of,
Yes.
it's not good
Yeah.
for you.
I
It
understand. They take on too much and it takes them on then.
Yeah, it takes its toll. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some etheric hygiene that you have to watch when you take on personalities.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
I had another association there. A friend of mine used to teach at Lycée International, which is a French acting school that that had located itself in a school out in the wealthy northern end of the greater Detroit metropolitan area in
Right.
Bloomfield Hills or Birmingham area. And Lycée Internationally, and he taught there. He would give these courses. Del Close, he was the one of the founders of Second City in Chicago, and so that
Right.
cast of characters from Saturday Night Live, they were
Mm-hmm.
all students of his, right? And he was
Mm-hmm.
into studying Kabbalah, and he'd work with that, and it was nice. I'd go see him. He'd be giving a class. It'd be this huge, like gymnasium, just packed with people, and there'd be a table. He'd be sitting there, and I'd be sitting next to him. So I got like again the bird's eye view, close
Yeah.
up, and he was a fascinating character who passed away some years ago. I still have an article on the bicameral mind that he gave me, the scientist. Not one he wrote, but he said, "Here, check this out." And it had to do
Yeah.
with surgical lesions
Yeah.
between hemispheres of the brain, and the
Yeah.
very,
That was Julian James
yeah,
did a
it's
big
tied
text
into,
on that. Yeah.
yeah, tied into that. The scientific uh, elaboration of that type of a view, the right and left
Right.
brain
Right.
type of activity. And he was very much into using like the Golden Dawn type material, where they have like assuming God forms and all that for doing ritual work. And so we'd be sitting there, and the guy would get up on stage, and he'd go, "Okay, you're a rasher of bacon." And the guy would have to do his version of what a rasher of bacon. That was, it was that whole idea of archetypal, the
Yeah.
Kabbalah, using the various planetary archetypes as a memory theater for approaching the various facets of the archetypal characters. And
Yeah.
so he was a funny guy, real funny guy.
Well, John, does the arts, bohemian, intellectual, Steiner, theater, spaghetti bowl that escorted you through the bookshop, does that basically carry you through middle age?
Well, yeah, because it's again, once you get to a certain point, it really just becomes uh, a part of your worldview, and the way I look at things is quite different from most of the people I met. But I don't proselytize, and so
Right.
it's kind of funny because over the years I've been doing these podcasts. There's a lot of people that know me that they don't know that side of me, and it's kind of a surprise to them. But
Right.
it's more on the level of if somebody asks something, then we can talk about it. That's the way it's always been. I didn't go door to door with brochures or anything like that.
What happened at middle age?
Well, actually, after I had left the bookstore, then Douglas came in there, Douglas Gabriel, and took my post as manager
And
for.
how
He was
old
there
were
for
you
about a
then?
year.
How
Well,
old were you?
that was in the maybe about 80, 82 or 3 or something like
What
that.
what's your astrological window? Were you 29, 37,
Uh,
42?
well,
Do you remember?
I'd have to figure it out. But so at
Okay.
83, so just yeah, like around the Saturn return, yeah,
30.
28.
Yeah, okay.
But
That's usually a
after
kicker.
the bookstore, I had a friend who created a relational database that was a computer system for filing, and of course, but it was empty. He just created the data field, and
What
I
was
took
his name?
that. Uh, I can't think of her. Just one of the people who used to come in the bookstore. I can't think of it right
Okay,
now.
just wondering. Anyway,
But just really an association.
yeah.
But one of our wealthy clients was Marjorie Fisher, the wife of Max Fisher, the prominent member. He was asked to take a cabinet post by 5 different presidents, and he would always turn them down and say, "No, I'm of more use for you out here."
Hmm. Yeah,
And but she had this fabulous collection of esoteric books that we had helped her to build up over the years. And I took that whole library and I inputted it into the relational database so that you could like look up a subject and it would tell you to go to this book, that book, and this book, for
right,
example.
right.
And after I did that, she had a daughter who was studying for her doctorate in Egyptology. She also studied Mesopotamian studies and could read cuneiform, and she could read hieroglyphics and hieratic and wonderful, wonderful soul. Margie, the daughter, went on to become a doctor of Egyptology out of
Right.
University of Michigan. But she had this, she has this huge library on Egyptology and Mesopotamian studies, and so I created a bibliography
Yeah.
of her library, and
Okay.
so that gave me an opportunity to really investigate closely. It's one of the largest private collections in the world, and most of the libraries bound it in leather, French bindings with, top edge gilt,
Sure.
marbled boards, and just absolutely sumptuous, like
Top of the line. Yeah,
top of the
top of the
line.
line.
Yes,
Yeah.
and
Beautiful.
so it gave me the opportunity, and I ended up becoming, really. I used to have like rare book specialists contact me to try and figure out the value of certain rare antiquarian volumes in Egyptology or any number of fields. I was very kind of active in communicating with antiquarian book dealers throughout the country. It was very
Right.
different at that time, though, because you didn't have the internet, right?
Right. Right. And a lot depended upon actual things you knew firsthand.
Yeah, and to be able to, like, there was a publication called the AB Bookman's Weekly, and
Yes, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
read it every week and go through there and try to find things. There's certain volumes that I have in my library that I might have been keeping an eye out for 25 years, and then finally run across a copy. It's like now you just go on, archive.org and there it is. It's like they
Mhm.
got books on there, limited printing, 50 copies kind of thing. It's like,
So you basically went from running a bookshop to becoming a professional archivist in a way.
yeah, I did that for that took quite a few years, because doing the one library and then going and doing the other one, that's a great deal of input. And but it was a wonderful experience, and again, when you get into specialized fields like that, people have no idea. They're not even aware of the literally thousands of books that are available on subjects that they never
Mhm.
see, that just
Right.
show up in specialist libraries and
Yeah, and now
university
we're even
libraries.
more carefully guided by Google and Amazon. so that our peripheral vision, as far as scanning the bookshelves, that is extinct.
It's not as good as it was even a few years ago.
Yeah, that's my impression. I don't know. I don't know if there's a solution for that, because there's nothing like scanning an entire 20-foot bookshelf with your eyes and your hands, as
Yeah,
opposed to looking at a 1-inch square screen at imaging sequences.
yeah, yeah. It's a very tactile thing, you know, and
Yeah,
to just hold in your hand. And if only books could talk. I mean, I have books here that are, a couple hundred years old,
yeah,
and
I get it. I get it. I sold a library when I was 40. I had a 4,000 volume library that I sold to pay off a plane ticket that I didn't seem to manage to pay off for 4 years. They juggled the interest rate, and I could never quite pay off that 4,000. And I thought, well, damn, they're going to make me sell my library, because I didn't want to live in debt. So I did sell it.
yeah,
It
I've
was
well,
a
I've
painful
gone through
experience.
building it up, and then it kind of goes away, uh,
Yeah,
and then you build it up again. It's funny because it's all about carving out time. How does one spend one's time? And there's so
yeah,
many distractions in life that it's easy for life to go by. And I tell people, the people that, because I get people approaching me regarding Rudolph Steiner's work, and I say, look, I'll be honest with you. There's a great deal of his material that's come into print, that a lot of it for the first time in English. It's available right now, but they're
yeah,
short printings, and once they're gone, you're going to see something you could have got for $18 end up $125. So if you're interested in that material, you might want to pursue uh, getting the volumes that interest you, because believe me, I could think of books that I have of Rudolph Steiner's. That's the only copy I've ever seen. It's like,
yeah,
uh, and so it's that kind of a challenge, because Rudolph Steiner's collected edition is 36.5 feet of shelf space in the original German, the Gesamtausgabe edition,
yeah.
and about what, maybe half of that, or not even half, has been in print in English.
Right, right.
It's, and you never know when he's gonna give you something key. I frequently tell this story. You wonder, and you're thinking and you're studying, and then finally you feel that you've got a grasp of something that he talks about, and then they go and he gives a lecture where he's explaining how to knit and make a doll, for a child, and in there he'll drop a little tidbit down that makes you realize that you were upside down in your assessment of that particular subject. I mean, you never
Yeah,
know when it's going to come, because he doesn't define things, because
that's right.
defining
And
do
it's
not
tricky.
lend themselves to the realities of the supersensible.
Yeah, and he wasn't he didn't necessarily, his life, his core of work, if you look at that long shelf, they're not in a particular sequence. And I
Right.
think that also makes it difficult for people, that there isn't a sequential thing wherein they can start with something simple and build up. And if you were to talk to someone who was relatively well read, but they had not read Steiner, what sequence of reading would you give them? And would you have them read Goethe before they even read Steiner?
Um, they wouldn't get the same thing out of reading Goethe if they read Goethe first. I mean, it would, a way to look at it, like, there's a great deal of the Western tradition is encoded, so to speak, in myths, legends, and fairy tales, and so that it presents to you in a picture language something that represents aspects that pertain to the supersensible. And so while they don't instruct you in the details of that, Rudolph Steiner says that what it does is it builds in you a capacity so that when you reincarnate in a future life, you'll have a facility towards that esoteric content that's behind that mythopoetic format, which
Right.
is,
Okay.
it builds in you. And that's kind of what we're looking at, like when he was talking about the Gratiano, the first Gratiano specifically, and he said, people look at it and they think that it's the building itself. He says it's the meaning of the Gratianum is the space within,
Right.
where there's nothing there. That's
Right.
that
Right.
you create
Potential.
a contact. Yeah, that's
Potential.
it's like the gap in the synapse
Yeah.
in the nervous system. That's where the exousiae can gaze into this realm.
Yeah. That's where the life is. It's in the spaces between the notes.
Yeah, the gaps. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, since we hit at about 55, maybe nearly 60 minutes, I'm going to close this up here, Mr. John Barnwell. And thank you for sharing something about your personal quest. I may request another one of these
Sure.
with you,
Anytime.
because I always find that the life path of other people is extremely informative. And usually I catch you from the theoretical side. And so I was interested in hearing, where you had left your wet footprints. And I appreciate it.